Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury. Good evening.
Good evening. It is carnage here. So
It is.
Hopefully listeners can hear me. But my home office is like a graveyard for headsets and audio input devices because nothing would work this evening.
Yeah, in the time it's taken for the opening titles to work, that's actually got worse. It's for some reason you seem like a distant Dalek. I don't know quite what's going on.
This is really rather magnificent, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, let's throw this. I've got one left, so I've used all the expensive kit that I've got. So let's in our case, I'm switching to the £5 earphones from some budget producer somewhere and see whether that does the trick.
Okay.
In the interim, how's your week been, Simon?
It's not been too bad. You know, I'll let you try and fiddle around with that a bit.
How's that?
I am getting an awful hum kind of coming from your end.
Right, let's try and throw some other stuff away just to make sure that's not interfering with the dreadfully cheap ones.
Right, the hum's gone.
That's gone. That was the...
Oh, it was. Now it's back. My apologies to our viewers.
Everybody, I'm throwing things off at my desk. As a rate of noise, there should now be nothing to create a hum.
Yeah, something still is. I've got no idea what it is. I'm almost tempted to say, can you not go back to the other what you had on before, and I'll put up with the clacketing noises.
Give that one a try.
Yeah. Shall I? While you do that, I'll.
Yes, talk me through what might be going on today, rather than just watching me die on my arse with respect to technology.
So thank you for joining us and putting up with our technical issues. Okay, so today's show, we have essentially 3 questions that we wanted to pose and actually kind of work through. And we're going to work through them together because we like doing these things as a team. Basically, those 3 questions are: is the freedom that is anonymity online, is that worth the price of online abuse? The second question is, in light of attacks on MPs, in order to make them safer, would that make them more distant and therefore keep them at arm's length from their constituents? And in which case, does actually protecting our MPs in that way, or our other elected officials in that way, does that diminish our democracy or defend it? And our third question will be, should MPs or other elected officials be allowed to take a second job? So there's kind of a bit of a theme kind of going through there as to what those sorts of things, what those concerns are, and to look at those. So if I start, I'm going to crack on while Ian kind of starts to look at that with regards to that. So in regards to online anonymity. So we put this question out onto the Portsmouth Politics Facebook page to actually get some engagement from people and see what their views were on that, and to see what ideas there were. But basically, many different MPs have reported concerns with online abuse, and indeed other public figures have, and indeed members of the public have reported concerns around exposure to harmful online and anonymous abuse. So is that essential freedom, the ability to actually be anonymous online, to be someone other than your verified identity, is that actually a freedom that's being abused? And is the the freedom to do that worth the cost that that actually gives? Ian, I couldn't hear you. I can't hear you. I can see you were talking, but I can't hear you. No. So to give some sort of like background to this in regards to looking at abuse that that MPs have received, in 2017, as Mina Drodia reported in the New Statesman, that an analysis of over 900,000 tweets over a 6-month period prior to the general election that year. For example, the call-outs from that analysis were that Black and Asian women MPs received 35% more abuse online than their white counterparts, and were receiving on average 14 abusive tweets per day. Black and Asian women MPs made up 11% of the female MPs in Westminster at that time. Another thing that data called out was that Diane Abbott, who was at the time an MP for the Labour Party, in the 6 weeks running up to the 2017 election, she received 45% of all of the abusive tweets that they analysed. Over the 6-month period, it was just under 32%. So there's some obvious concerns there about people receiving particular abuse, and indeed, actually, in the 2019 election, there were also some issues with regard to abuse that was being received. So to try and actually sort those things out, the government are proposing an online harms bill, and indeed there was a backbench motion actually put forward and discussed in Parliament in March to discuss actually whether anonymity online should be included into the online harms bill. You know, as we know, the online harms bill is kind of progressing, but to give a kind of a shape of 2019, just to give an idea of the 2019 general election, the members of Parliament or candidates for Parliament that received the topmost of abusive tweets in a similar analysis 6 months prior to that were the leaders of the two major parties, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, but in order they were Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, Michael Hancock, Michael Gove, David Lammy, Joe Swinson, James Cleverly, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Sajid Javid, and Diane Abbott. So again, a massive amount of online abuse. And forgive me, I'll give a caveat about the swear words that accused in you used in this information. And this information comes from some data on EPJ Data Science, which was collated by various parties there, which we'll comment to in the information when we post the upload. But just to give an idea, and there is swearing here, so again, our apologies for calling that out. But yes, the 10 most used terms in the 6 months prior to the general election in 2019, basically F off, idiot, the T word, coward, idiots, scum, the C word, moron, piss off, and wanker. So a wide, sadly, a wide range of various insults that were levelled at various different people. So again, we'll include the links so that people can go and actually see the detailed argument there and the information. So there is obviously a level of abuse that's being directed at MPs and at candidates online. Some MPs have actually cited that as a reason for them considering stepping down, and some of them have even cited that as a reason for them to decide to change the way they vote. So in that respect, it's an impact on democracy. And at that point, I'm just going to pause and see whether Ian, is your sound back in the room? I can see you, but I can't hear you. Got no sound coming through. I shall carry on while you struggle with that. if that's okay. Okay, so by all means, do hit me up with some comments in the chat. So either on YouTube or on Facebook, please do those. And don't forget, you can join us live every week on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and catch us as upload later in the evening from all your favourite podcast providers. You can see us there. So, and don't forget to join us next week in Health of the Nation, when we will be asking when at a time that the care sector is now mandated for vaccination, and that's due to come in. The government are talking about bringing that in for the NHS. Should that be brought in any other sectors, and if so, which? And bearing in mind that's at a time when the NHS are about to face yet again a difficult winter, obviously struggling with the normal winter pressures and the pressures of COVID. So join us next week at 6:27 when we discuss that. So the online harms bill. So the government are proposing a piece of legislation which Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, has said will basically end abuse, full stop. If it's racist, if it's misogynistic, if it's anti-Semitic, if it's any kind of toxic content that breaks a social media company's terms and conditions, whether hiding behind a fake name or not, it will be removed. And that piece of legislation calls on the regulator Ofcom to then have the power to be able to actually fine companies either £18 million or 10% of their global turnover, whichever is the greater. So obviously 10% of a global turnover of a company like Facebook is a huge amount of money. And the government saying that basically the online harms bill, that it aims to provide a free, open and secure internet, freedom of expression online, an online environment where companies take effective steps to keep their users safe, where rules and norms for the internet that discourage harmful behaviour, and the UK is a thriving digital economy and a prosperous ecosystem of companies developing innovation in online safety, and its citizens understand the risks of online activity, challenge unacceptable behaviours, and know how to access help if they experience harm online, with children receiving extra protection specifically. And obviously there'll be moves to work with other countries to get similar measures across the board and to deliver those, as many of these companies are indeed not based in the UK. So that's the government trying to bring into play its measures with regards to protecting people online. And there's a couple of different ways to look at that. There's indeed been an online petition that has reached 700,000 signatures online, calling on the government to legislate and require that you need to provide verifiable ID. So, for example, a passport or a driving license in order to actually set up an account online. So, so that is.
That's not
so I can hear you now, Ian. I can hear you now. Ian,
we
can you
can
hear me?
only just hear you, and it's on full volume.
Okay, I don't know what's going there, but I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, we'll try and work with that.
Right. While you do that, I'm just going to continue talking about the government response to the petition. You're right. I'll just set you up and bring you in. So I've just been going over the basically some examples of the online harms, and actually the prevalence of how they're directed at particular
people. We
people.
are still having some technical issues in that
we can't hear you.
We can't hear you in a way that we could communicate. We can hear that there's a noise there.
I don't know what's happened there, but I was able to hear you, but now I can't. So I don't know what's going on. It looks like your internet connection is just frozen. Can hear you now. I can hear you now.
I think you can hear us fine, but
we can literally only just hear you.
It's coming out as a murmur.
Okay. I'm at my normal volume this end. Anybody following on the chat? Can they tell us if they can hear me okay? If not, then we can kind of see that that's kind of an issue my end. But I've got the volume at the usual sort of levels, and I can see the sound coming through as normal.
Let's mute. Let's turn the camera off. Settings. Audio.
Okay, so I'm getting from the chat. Thanks, Malcolm, for letting us know. So I'm getting a report that the sound is okay.
Yeah.
There should be there's a little cog there where you should be able to set the audio settings and change the input and the output.
Yeah, I've done that. It doesn't make any difference what I do.
Okay.
You're still really quiet.
I don't
My
know
iPad
what's happening
volume
there.
is up at full, but the incoming volume on the audio input, I don't
Right.
know. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what to do.
I'm trying to think of a way around it. If I call you, and then you can hear me that way, will that create a massive feedback issue? My apologies to the audience for the technical issues as we're struggling with this. Please do bear with us.
The only other
I
thing, Simon, is if we kill the video, you call me and I'll just come in audio only.
I can't pick up the phone call actually on the streaming platform. We can't actually take.
Give me a call. We'll turn the microphone. If we can give me a call, we'll try and turn the microphone off and see whether that works.
Okay, hang on a second.
Shall I leave?
Let's hang there a moment and see what effect that has. Yellow?
Hello, you just hung up on me.
Hello?
Hello.
Is that giving you feedback issues at your end?
Well, I can hear them. The question is whether or not the audience. Sorry, Malcolm, can I impose on you again? Can you tell me whether you're getting problems with hearing me, with hearing basically feedback as I've got a phone call live?
Mute.
Malcolm saying that your sound is also okay.
Marvellous. Let's go from here then. Well, thank you, Simon, for going through the background there, and also for anybody who's listening online for bearing with us through this rather tortuous period.
Indeed. So I'll if I can I'll just conclude the bit. So I was just talking about the petition that had been raised asking for about online anonymity, and I'm calling on the government to include the requirement for online social media providers to require ID. The government's response to that petition was that they were concerned that restricting all users' right to anonymity by introducing compulsory user verification for social media could disproportionately impact users who rely on anonymity to protect their identity. These users include young people exploring their gender or sexual identity, whistleblowers, journalists, sources, and victims of abuse. Introducing a new legal requirement whereby only verified users can access social media would force these users to disclose their identity and increase a risk of harm to their personal safety. And furthermore, users without ID or users who are reliant on ID from family members would experience a serious restriction of their online experience, freedom of expression and rights. And research from the Electoral Commission suggests that there are 3.5 million people in the UK who do not currently have access to valid photo ID. And the source for that is from the petition.parliament.uk website.
Yeah, and I think I struggle with that one though, Simon, to be honest, because there is an element of, ultimately the requirement for you to have a valid identity. For me, that doesn't necessarily affect the identity with which you present with. So there is an element of whilst you know whilst there is a valid issue there around potential digital exclusion, surely the fact of if you have to have valid identity to to get onto those platforms, that can remain masked and is only there as a point of reference should you be involved in any wrongdoing, online abuse, or threatening behaviour. And that's the bit that I struggled with, and I read that piece when you sent it over earlier. It's an element of, at the moment, anyone can set up a dozen sock puppet accounts, and they do in seconds, and start abusing people. And provided they're masking their internet, their whatever the number's called, they can do that with complete freedom and abandon.
So, indeed, and I mean, the question that we've posed kind of sets up a binary answer, doesn't it? It sets up either online anonymity is a good or a worth the cost for rather than specifically a good, or it's overall a bad thing. But indeed, in possible solutions, there was some debate in the Facebook groups that we posted the question to, with regards to potential ways that you could solve that. So you could go as far as the China route, where you're required to actually use visual ID and indeed facial recognition in order to gain access to the internet or mobile services, and you could require the internet companies, for example, to keep that as secure as bank accounts, and banks are meant to keep bank accounts secure. So there are concerns about that information being hacked and becoming public. But you could also do other things. But if you had that sort of level of measure, at what point do you say that a judge is able, for example, to instruct the internet company or the social media company to release that person's identity? And there you start getting into sticky situations of, very quickly you'll have situations where a whistleblower is someone that's actually sharing information that needs to be made public, whereas a government would probably quite quickly find a way to define that as an issue for national security or for other things. So it kind of opens up a whole storm of where do you draw the line and who watches the watchers, kind of in that sort of way. But Siobhan Bailey, who was the Conservative MP that led the backbench motion in March, actually called for a different solution. Her solution was that basically require internet companies and social media companies to allow people to voluntarily declare voluntarily verify their identity, but then also set their accounts to block being viewed and commented by people who didn't verify their identities. So they could therefore deliberately choose not to receive comment or posts from people whose identities were masked or were pseudonyms. So in that respect, that kind of gives a different kind of way to do it. And indeed, in her debate, she said no one should face the abuse and horror that you will hear about for the victims of online harm. The abuse is not virtual. It does not stay in cyberspace. It impacts the real lives of real people in the real world. If we fail to properly investigate the impact and options surrounding anonymity, I fear we will render any forthcoming legislation and change, no matter how good it is, out of touch and out of date before the ink is dry. So there were views to the other side. In fact, former Labour MP Ruth Smith, who is the head of Index on Censorship said, we have to do something to tackle and improve our online culture, but a knee-jerk response to ban anonymous accounts will have unintended consequences, not just on our collective free speech, but on our ability to engage with whistleblowers and dissidents in every corner of the world. And I guess that kind of speaks to, if we require social media companies to put in any particular sorts of measures, there will be other countries that will use those particular measures for nefarious means. And when you look back in history and you look at the sorts of controls that the Chinese government has over access to the internet, or indeed, actually, was it the Saudi government requiring back in the day, BlackBerry, when they were a thing, that BlackBerry Messenger, because at the time I think that was the only encrypted messenger service that they required, basically the encryption keys from BlackBerry in order to allow that users to use that service in their country. So I guess if we're trying to find a way that because we need to stop this online harm, we need to stop the faceless abuse. Is the abuse actually predominantly anonymous, and is actually banning it outright, a sledgehammer to crack a very, very, very large nut? But it seems, to be honest, that the suggestion by Siobhan Bailey actually, I think there's some merit in that as a way of providing safety for those that want it, and isolation for those that want it from people that pretend to be someone other than pretend not, don't have actually their real verified data. So that might be a way forward.
Yeah, but I think it becomes a muddled halfway house then, doesn't it? Because, there's an element of, if you are a public figure and you want to protect yourself from online abuse, so you set your kind of settings that say, well, I only want to see content that comes from those that have passed some kind of UK-based validation step. Well, that sounds like a UK-centric solution. So, potentially will limit your exposure to international, more diverse arrangements, or potentially you get forums where, you're only going to see half the comments because half of the comments are from people who have no nefarious intent, but have the libertarian. I'm not prepared to disclose my identity to quote unquote the state, or a vassal of the state that would share my true identity.
Yes, but banning anonymity outright would force them to do that anyway.
Well, it depends, doesn't it? And I think it's that element, and you touched on it earlier with the, who watches the watchers. There is an element of, you have bank details. Your bank details are your own. You have to prove that you are a bona fide to get a bank account. But your bank account details are not shared unless there is a reasonable suspicion that you have been using your bank account for nefarious activity. And, the subtleties of where that's drawn in law, we have that in place for financial transactions, which should and obviously remain private. So it doesn't strike me as beyond the wit of man that we couldn't replicate that for the online identity issue.
Perhaps. I mean, indeed, the other kind of, I guess, part of the equation is that social media companies see themselves as not being publishers, and normally, if someone actually publishes something, they have to actually, they normally have to actually say who the publisher is, so that if there's an issue with it, to be blunt, then someone knows who to sue. So if someone was to anonymously daub something insulting on the side of a house, for example, the person that owns that house isn't responsible for what's been written, but they would probably quite quickly want to actually cover that up because they don't want something so distasteful actually sitting on the side of their house. It doesn't make their house look very good. But from a point of view of, are they responsible for the harm that was put on the side of their house? No, but they are responsible for making sure that further people don't get to see it. Would you, in order to stop people being able to paint things on the side of people's houses, restrict the sale of spray paint or instill a curfew, no, I don't think we would.
No, and I think that there is that element of the duty of care of the social media companies, and it's something that they've skirted around and muddied the waters on for a number of years now. But I guess the piece for me, which is where they can't be held responsible, it is the fact that. And again, it was the headline in the Portsmouth News this week that pupils at a college in Horndean had posted on TikTok that, frankly, they would rather the head teacher was dead and that it would be appropriate to gouge her eyes out. Now, even once that's taken down, that threat and the ghastly language and the horror that I'm sure that has caused won't be undone just by deleting that post. In that story, very fortunately, there has been they've found the pupil responsible, and it was, again, they have a restorative justice program where they discussed it openly, and the excuse for posting that was, well, I just wanted to get more attention and likes, which again beggars belief, but it's the reality of how some people think it's okay to behave online because they see what they're doing as a victimless crime. And it's that piece for me where somebody who has behaved like that, or worse, I genuinely believe there has to be a route back to trace the true identity of the person who's making such vile threats.
Indeed, I don't think anybody's calling for people to be able to continue to make offensive comments with impunity. I think the $64 million question is, how do you stop it without there being unintended consequences that you wouldn't want in a free and fair democratic society? It was interesting that some reports elsewhere that of the instructions given to moderators on Facebook that that particular things weren't considered, and they were things that were calling for attacks on MPs, for example, that they weren't considered actually hateful speech and shouldn't be removed, when obviously quite clearly, I think, to be honest, to you and me and any other sensible person,
Yep.
that they are, and that they should be removed. And in fact, even if they didn't think that, I'd kind of question that maybe providers such as Facebook should be questioning whether they want their platform to be connected with that sort of language and that sort of anger and attack. And it's just wrong. You did some analysis earlier on the early hours of a couple of posts on Facebook today. Should we talk through that?
Yeah, so again, it was a very simple piece where I looked at the Facebook accounts of Sir Keir Starmer and of Boris Johnson, and picked just a couple of their Facebook posts at random. Boris Johnson, a very positive and sort of, I'm travelling by train in the North and the Midlands and follow my progress live online. And one from Keir Starmer that was more critical, who basically said, alluded to HS2 and the government's announcement and was more critical. So I sort of flicked back through the I think it was the last 50 sort of comments that have been made on there. And, very interested to see whether people were sort of disagreeing nicely or agreeing nicely, and whether there was actually, whether people had got abusive in terms of their response. And I think, because obviously you're sharing a slide on screen now that's got some of that detail in it, Simon.
Yes, I am indeed. I realise I've left the wrong title on the graphic there, so apologies for any confusion. But yes, so this was an analysis of about 50 comments on each of the posts that were made both by the Prime Minister or Keir Starmer's and Keir Starmer's accounts. So analysis of 50 comments on each, but these were both posts actually made today. So looking at the looking at that, 50% of them on Keir Starmer's and 76% of them on Boris Johnson's post were either agreeing or disagreeing nicely. So they were playing nice. They were being good netizens, as it were. But 24% of the comments on Keir's post and 14 on the PM's post were specific insults towards Boris Johnson or Tories in general.
Yep.
And sorry, go on.
And again, these were kind of not commenting on the topic, and they were a range of, kind of, again, abusive or insulting. It's, things like, well, what do you expect? All Tories are criminals and thieves. It was sort of, there were very few that made your eyebrows raise in terms of, actually, that's really not appropriate. So it was just the general kind of, what I would say, we talked about it before, that sort of cartoon demonization of the people who aren't you. I guess you would expect there to be more anti-Tory feeling on those that had that followed Keir Starmer, but there was still quite a significant chunk of people that followed Boris, who were pretty derisory in their approach. I think for me, the one that probably stood out as most offensive was that it said that Boris is getting away with it like Jimmy Savile, and you just want what he's got, which I was on Keir's thread, which I looked at and thought, well, that is really, really distasteful. And again, there's no excuse for that.
No, indeed, and the colour, the thing that you pointed out was that 14% on Keir's post and 6% on Boris Johnson's post were challenges to the poster's leadership.
Yeah, so these were kind of attacks on the leader, and it was interesting that I would say, they were all from the extremes wings of their own parties. So in Sir Keir's sort of space, it was basically that he's not really Labour, he's a Tory in disguise, and Jeremy Corbyn would have been so much better, and you've failed the party by etc., etc. And the three that were on Boris's comments were all the same, that were effectively that your government's not doing enough to crack down on those trying to cross the channel, in various degrees of colourful language. So it would appear that it, again, interestingly in this case, it wasn't the quote other team poking at the leaders. It was their own side, but the more extreme edges of them.
Yeah, and what was also interesting was that on the post by Keir Starmer, 6% of them were commenting on Boris Johnson not wearing a face mask, and 4% of them were insulting to Keir Starmer or Labour, but neither of those things were covered at all on the posts from the PM.
And it's difficult because, again, 50 sounds like a reasonable number of comments when there were nearly 200 on Keir's and over 1,000 on Boris's. I'm sure again, it's a representative sample, but also there's an element of what I don't know is whether on both posts there have been more extreme comments that have been moderated or deleted before I got to them. So I think as a very much a straw poll, I think it is that element of it, I guess it shows what we've seen on a number of these, which is that it's almost a sliding scale where there is a bit of negativity through to some sort of general name calling, through to some stuff that then becomes either very personal or very sinister.
Indeed, and as some of the MPs and indeed Siobhan Bailey said in her speech, those things don't, sometimes sadly and horrifically, those things don't stay online, and that probably takes us actually to our next point, which was about MP safety, or about the safety of our elected officials. Now, if we look just to give us an idea about, obviously, I'm sure everybody's aware of, sadly the recent murder attack on Sir David Amess. But when you look at actually attacks since the beginning of this century, in 2016, of course, sadly there was the murder of Joe Cox. But in 2010, Stephen Timms was stabbed twice in the stomach at his East London constituency surgery. Because he was his aide was. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry. Yes, sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm getting confused there. So in 2000, Andrew Pennington, who is the aide of Nigel Jones MP, was stabbed to death by a samurai sword-wielding attacker during their attack, in which Nigel Jones was also injured. So in the case of, if you think of any working environment of 650 people over the space of 21 years, there's two fatalities of MPs. There's two severe injuries of MPs, and actually of a murder of actually one of their assistants. So in any other workplace, health and safety would be crying out to say, quite rightly, hang on, what the hell is going on, and what's being done to keep people safe. And there was some conversation shortly after Sir David Amess's murder that what could be done to keep MPs safer, and that kind of ranges from the questions of, to keep them safer, do they hold their constituency surgeries in specific public buildings that have been equipped to actually keep them safer, or buildings that have got security scanners or have actually security staff? Do you start to require people visiting them to book in advance and have background checks actually completed in advance? And those are the sorts of things that were talked about as, from a security perspective, as to the sorts of things that you could do. But what was interesting is, considering actually the abuse that we talked about previously, and obviously these horrific attacks, that these aren't the sorts of things that actually MPs or other elected officials are actually calling for. But it is a when you think at a more local level, local councillors might be on their own in a church hall or a community centre, just a lone councillor actually there dealing with queries from the public. And for them, it's an important thing that actually any member of their community can actually come in and speak to them if they need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And MP surgeries are much the same, aren't they? There is it is a great tradition of British democracy that there are those kind of open surgeries where you can rock up and chat to your nominated member of parliament. And I think, and this one is one of those real conundrums, because, as you say, if you look at it statistically, the level is terrifying. But I guess it's that piece that then talks to, how from a safety and from a security perspective, do you deal with the lone wolf attacker? And we've seen them. Last weekend there was that potential bomb incident at Liverpool, where thankfully no one other than the attacker lost their life, and the very brave taxi driver suffered minor injuries, but only by his quick thinking it sounds like there were significant numbers of people that would be harmed. And I think this is where, in terms of there being a tension between democracy and terrorism, it's how much do you change the way in which we live our normal lives to try and guard against the threat of the lone wolf.
Indeed, it is indeed a conundrum, and sadly, Sir David Amess himself actually said these increasing attacks have rather spoiled the great British tradition of the people openly meeting their elected politicians. We all make ourselves readily available to our constituents and are often dealing with members of the public who have mental health problems. it could happen to any of us. And that's scarily foretelling, isn't it? And a police review of reported crimes against MPs between 2016 and 2020 said that there were 678 crimes reported, but that they suspected that there were a great deal that weren't reported. And at the same time, from a perspective of providing the right sort of equipment to allow MPs and to keep themselves and their staff safe, there were concerns reported. The concerns reported by Orbi Allegretti in the Guardian, where they'd actually spoken to some MPs and they'd actually raised concerns that either they were waiting up to 10 months to get safety equipment fitted to their home from the contractor employed to do that, or that they were waiting, or that contractor cited delays in getting the budget signed off by IPSO, which is the Independent Parliamentary Standards Office, but also concerns that those that did have individual panic alarms, so the basically the lone support device, that when they'd actually been triggered accidentally or indeed as a test, that they didn't receive any contact to actually make sure that they were okay, which is what's meant to happen in those sorts of situations. So the concern is that even though there are steps to provide equipment to try to help keep MPs and their staff safer and their families safer, that they're finding it difficult to get that and for it to work when they do. So I think there's a competency question perhaps about actually what is currently being arranged, but also from a wider point, it seems that there isn't a desire to lock, as it were, MPs away, and I think most of them would actually be quite horrified by that prospect. They value that connection with their constituents, and indeed, so do any representatives in other levels of government. So in that respect, the knee jerk of the putting them in more secure locations is perhaps not the desired way forward, but we need to do something. Something needs to be done to keep those representatives safe. And when we're trying to encourage representatives of every level to be more diverse and reflective of the type of society that we live in, seeing how dangerous it is being an elected official, or seeing how much abuse even being a candidate can put one in for, and that can be leveled at your family or at your friends or your work colleagues, all of those sorts of things can only put people off of wanting to get involved in politics of any level, and that is a poor thing for our society as a whole and for our democracy.
For me, Simon, I think it's important that we actually link the two, because I think that one is a continuum of the other, and I think there is an element of I think there is and again, it's troubled me for some time, that there is almost a dehumanization of politicians. There's a labeling of they are a this or they are a that, or Tories are scum, and you kind of these are human beings, and whilst we might not agree with their politics, whilst we might not agree with the way they conduct themselves in public office, that for me is about an individual, and criticism should be levelled objectively and fairly. For me, it's the language of hatred and the language of aggression that, I've said it many times before, we would not tolerate that against any other identifiable group in society, perhaps with the exception of a rival football club. And I think there is this element of, ultimately, if we want to absolutely ensure MP safety and to guarantee it, then you are into the kind of security that surrounds the Prime Minister or one of the significant royals. If you look at the Prime Minister does not go anywhere without a full 24/7 security detail that watches his every move.
Indeed, sadly, as time's gone on, it seems that the risk to high-profile figures has grown, but it also seems that the risk to public figures further down the pecking order has also greatly increased. As you say, that sadly these lone wolf attacks and things like that that are probably exceedingly difficult, if not next to impossible, for security services to look for. But again, that kind of also speaks to our kind of previous point about the sorts of harms that are encouraged or indeed educated for online, and what can be done to make sure that people can't radicalize themselves or can't learn those things. And there are existing protections that kind of stop those things, but it seems that are very, very connected 24/7 instant response lives. The law hasn't caught up with them yet, and the powers that the police has to use to do that hasn't caught up with that. But at the same time, you legislate at haste and regret it in leisure. And
Yeah.
it's a very tricky thing to try to get right.
And I think it's an area where there has been progress made. If you look at the approach the police now take, to hate crimes and racially aggravated or racially motivated attacks, I think that when they happen in quite a physical life, there is a more robust response than there's ever been. But I think there is an element of those kind of verbal attacks that happen online, and you touched on it in your earlier piece while I was throwing packets around my home office. The fact that Asian and black female MPs are targeted disproportionately is a reflection on the fact that those thoughts and those attitudes are sadly still prevalent in society. Now, people couldn't shout them in the street without facing some kind of fairly serious sanction. But it would seem that they still believe it's okay to shout them online, no matter how aggressive that might be.
Indeed, and that's that's almost how our society and our cultural norms haven't moved with what's technologically available. But at the end of the day, public sensibility has to kind of remain at a place where we need to, for me, we need to reclaim the ability to disagree politely, and to disagree nicely. And that's kind of like their overarching hope. But sadly, there are some people that are out of the ability to do that, and whether that will be for the various reasons, or whether that will be for medical reasons, even at the end of the day, there needs to be something in place to protect that, and indeed actually to stop even online algorithms actually continually putting similar sorts of things in front of them, so that they're not steadily actually finding themselves an extremist viewpoint being validated by the sorts of things that turn up on their YouTube feed, or indeed turn up on their Facebook feed. So I think we've got to that. So should we touch on the last point, which is about the question about second jobs? So
obviously my usual ability to monitor time is somewhat bereft as I am. So how are we doing time instantly?
So we're at 23 minutes past, but I wondered whether we could do a quick kind of 10 minutes on it.
Yeah, of course we can. So the question, and again it's been live in Parliament this week, about should MPs be able to have second jobs, lobbying potentially, using their parliamentary privilege. So the question, I guess, is where do you draw the line? Obviously, we had the rather unsavoury affair. I've forgotten the man's name. Tried to blot him from my.
Owen Paterson.
No, Mr. Paterson. I hope Mr. Paterson. So Mr. Paterson obviously was found to have, been lobbying and using his parliamentary privilege to gain access for clients who are paying him a very decent additional salary. He has now resigned, triggering a by-election. So I guess it is then, there was then the debacle of the Prime Minister trying to change the rules and twisting the arms of 248 MPs to vote to change the rules, potentially to protect him. That fell flat on its face a day later, as I think the optics of that were obvious to everyone. And so a debate started in Parliament this week about whether, to try and restrict the amount of additional work that MPs do above and beyond.
So I guess kind of we spoke earlier on about unintended consequences for measures that could deal with online anonymity, for example. But the unintended consequence of banning second jobs outright would be that would that severely limit the sort of people that ended up being political candidates and indeed ended up being elected to Parliament? Would that mean that the sorts of people that are, so for example, there are sitting MPs that are doctors, that are nurses, that are practicing lawyers? Aren't they actually a benefit to the House and to the wider debate that goes on in the House of Commons because of their background, and because of their background, they need to keep their toe in, as it were, to keep up their certification and relevancy of those skills. So by banning second jobs outright, you may well actually make being an MP the purview of people that already have money. And actually can manage quite well without their existing job for 5 or 10 years or whatever, how long someone ends up actually serving as an MP for. There are existing rules about what's allowed from a level of employer. So I guess the fundamental part of the question kind of comes down to: do you go for an outright ban? Or do you allow certain occupations, or do you limit the amount of time that can be spent in those things? So, for example, if you ban them as being paid jobs, would you then be requiring that lawyer that needs to keep up their certification, or that doctor or nurse that needs to keep up their training and skills to remain relevant? Would you then be asking them to do whatever's required in that field to do 10, 15 hours a month unpaid in order to do that? Would that put people off? Perhaps. Or how do you restrict it? Do you have an outright ban? Do you restrict certain professions? Because acting as a consultant for certain companies, especially companies that act in sectors where legislation is being discussed, and if you're in a position where you can bend the ear of the government, as it were, in order to help get that company's kind of view across. We've seen the accusations about access to MPs or indeed secretaries of state with regard to things like the Aquin project locally, all those sorts of things. How do you do that? Where, because I think what everybody wants to have is a parliament where we know that MPs are operating with being an MP is their primary focus. It's not their second job. It's their primary focus. But we also surely want MPs to be people that reflect the society that they serve, but also come to it with experience from outside of politics, that they aren't basically career politicians. And maybe insisting on no second jobs would mean that more of them are career politicians.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately for me, the optics of it, it's one of these strange ones when you try and write the rules, write the laws. It's going to be very difficult to do, but it's almost a case of you can see what's right and what's wrong, isn't it? If at the end of the day, a parliamentary lobbying group that is acting on behalf of a number of clients are paying you £100,000 a year as a retainer for 2 hours a month, then that doesn't look right, does it? Because at the end of the day, these people aren't, their altruism isn't necessarily paying you, that amount of money. They're paying you £10,000 an hour to keep you sweet. And it's not necessarily about the money per se, because highly paid barristers, barristers command a massive hourly rate, and so again, you can look at those earnings and think, well, they're colossal, but that's just what barristers earn. So, yeah, I think it is proportionate, and I did a bit of digging to see what our two local MPs, whether they were what their register of interests were. So, and I think it's good news for both of our local MPs, really.
Yes, so I've just put up on screen the information that you sourced from the theyworkforyou.com website, where our two local MPs, Stephen Morgan for Portsmouth South and Penny Mordaunt, and I just realised on my slide I've misspelt Penny's surname, so my apologies, Penny. That although Penny hadn't had a second job since 2020. The only second job that Stephen had was actually as an existingly serving councillor on Portsmouth City Council, and he'd actually donated that allowance to charitable organisations.
It's charitable and voluntary.
Mhm.
But again, I'm still not sure how I kind of feel about that, if I'm honest. There's an element of, and yes, it is much better than him just pocketing it, but there's also an element of me of, you are taking £20,000 over the course of 18 months from the public purse and then using it to become your own personal philanthropist to give it away to those people and organisations that you see fit. So I'm still not convinced that to take it and give it away is as noble as not taking it at all.
But I don't think you have an option to not take it. That's the point.
Yeah, well, I guess it's that question, isn't it? It's that second job question, which is if your role is a full-time member of Parliament for Portsmouth South, can you do that and also act as a ward councillor for the Charles Dickens ward effectively? And I guess that Stephen obviously felt he could, and did that until this May, where he stepped away.
Well, I mean, indeed, at the end of the day, that's a question for the people of Charles Dickens ward, in relation to him being a councillor,
Yep.
but in relation to obviously him being an MP, the people of Portsmouth South returned him with a resounding increase in his majority in 2019. So they can't seem to obviously have any grumbles with regards to that. But again, that's a further question of if you have an outright ban on second job, a second job would also include being a councillor.
Absolutely.
So
and if we look at the other data, Penny has had two gifts from two corporate gifts, one of £2,000 from a holding company in Fareham, one of £10,000 from a consultancy in London, and then I think she had one personal contribution from a Sir Michael. I'm doing this all from memory. So effectively, it had £15,000 in, if you like, contributions that had been declared. And I have to say, I was surprised, because if you would have asked me before I did this piece of research, I would have expected Penny Mordaunt, as a Conservative, to have more money in from business and other sources, whereas in fact Stephen had a benefit in kind of 6,600 from a satellite company to go to Denver and Florida to go and see NASA and watch a satellite launch, and then it received just over £10,000 from three different unions, one of which was cited as to be able to print leaflets, so it was about £10,000 in total. And then it had two individuals who made private donations to him. So ultimately, if you compare like for like, even if we discount the 20,000 that had come in via his role as a local councillor, it was just £20,000 over 18 months.
Yeah. So obviously our two MPs on perhaps examples of the concern that's being raised, that's being raised nationally. I'm sure if we picked perhaps some other MPs, we might find some differing results. But I guess it speaks to the larger question of who does your MP work for? Do they work for their constituents? Is that their primary focus of their time? And if it's not the primary focus of their time, what are they doing, and who has the primary focus of their time, and basically who has their ear because they've got they're on their payroll. So again, speaks to the wider question: do we want to ban second jobs outright, or do we want to have a more measured response that restricts consultancies, or restricts particular kind of lobbying organizations, or restricts it by the amount of time? But at the end of the day, I think any sensible legislation that responds to this has got to take those things into account. Otherwise, we just end up with a parliament that's just full of career politicians, and that's the last thing we need.
Absolutely. It feels like with the pendulum swung too far in terms of the lobbying. It needs to swing back towards the more centre. But as you say, what we don't want to do is create an environment where only career politicians thrive, and that variety of life experience is lost, or the only people that stand for Parliament are those who already have a private income through family wealth, and we are an even less diverse Parliament than we are today.
Indeed.
So,
and that seems like a good place to.
Indeed, in summary, I guess I need to say a massive thank you to Nikki Morris, my wife, your sister, for salvaging this evening's podcast with various technical solutions. And you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. Join us next week when we'll be asking about the health of the nation, and asking, with it now being mandatory to have vaccinations in care home settings, and that being brought in the NHS, should that be brought into any other sectors, and if so, which ones? Join us next week at 6:27, when hopefully we'll have kicked the technical gremlins into touch.